I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice even. When that smug county inspector placed the notice of occupancy on my kitchen table, the one stating that my family's property now officially belonged to Willow Ridge Homeowners Association, I remained composed. Instead, I dug into the drawer and pushed my own piece of paper forward, my grandfather's 1962 roadway easement deed, signed by a county judge he had personally known. A single piece of yellowed parchment that read, in plain as day terms, "All ingress and egress to the Willow Valley subdivision shall pass exclusively through Morrison Road, held in perpetuity by the Morrison family." Translation? You can construct all the McMansions you desire, but when your brand new occupants come searching for a route home, they'll find that the sole road into your multimillion-dollar utopia belongs to me. And believe me, I don't lease it out at bargain prices. They believed they could bury me under contractors, legal technicalities, and fence crews. But while they were busy laying down concrete and signing phony HOA bylaws, I owned their single point of failure. The residents weren't property owners. They were renters of my driveway. See, Karen's thing is, the queen of Willow Ridge HOA, is that she does not think 2 steps ahead. Okay, sure, she might bulldoze barns, hike up dues, or intimidate shy neighbors into selling their farms out from under them. But she never referenced the plat maps. She never asked who owned the skinny strip of gravel that linked her cookie-cutter kingdom to the great outdoors. Knowledge nugget number 1. In real estate law, access is paramount. A subdivision can't be had without legal ingress and egress ways. Block those, and you don't merely inconvenience folks. You choke property values to death overnight. I didn't yell when they filed zoning revisions behind my back. I didn't complain when bulldozers rolled over hay fields my grandfather and I had spent summers cutting. I didn't even flinch when Karen herself drove her pearl-white BMW onto my porch and chirped, "It's just business, honey. Progress. You can't fight the future." Oh, but you can. And I had 1.7 miles of dusty gravel road to prove her wrong. As their homes rose up, so did my bargaining power. Each cinder block placed, each delivery truck driving down my street, each resident bringing in furniture into a house constructed on my land, they all were indebted to me for a toll. And when the HOA attempted to bury me under fines, oh, let's just say this troubled veteran had a few more than war stories in his back pocket. I had documents, patience, and a 40-year plan. So fasten your seatbelts, because you're about to read about one road, a little bit of legal forethought, and a whole lot of Texas grit that brought an entire HOA empire to its knees. Karen Thornfield, 55 years old, president of the Willow Ridge HOA. The kind of woman who irons her tennis skirts and treats HOA bylaws like scripture. If Hallmark ever made a movie about suburban dictators, she'd win Best Leading Role without auditioning. Everyone in Willow County recognized her before she recognized them. She was that voice on every passive-aggressive email, the glare on every friendly reminder to bring your trash cans off the curb 5 minutes sooner. Perfectly coiffed blonde hair stiffly sprayed, a pearl necklace she accessorized even to zoning board meetings, and a cloud of perfume so pungent you could smell her coming around the corner before you saw that self-satisfied smile. Karen possessed what I describe as weaponized politeness. She could say to you she was taking your land, and managed to make it sound as though she was inviting you to be baked a batch of cookies. But beneath that saccharine tone lay entitlement as thick as you could shovel it. Her husband, Rick Thornfield, was a city councilman. Shocker that. If Karen was the HOA queen, Rick was her trusty knight of backroom politics. The pair were a beautiful storm of minor bureaucracy and big city politics. With Rick steamrolling zoning changes faster than you can say, conflict of interest, Karen could swoop in with construction crews masquerading as community improvement. But the twist is this. Karen really thought that by covering up fields and placing granite countertops within boring houses, she was improving the world. She didn't notice neighbors, history, or family heritage. She noticed empty spaces on a map longing to be filled with HOA fees and trimmed hedges. And when the land trust of my grandfather fell into my hands, she saw possibility. She thought I'd never notice when overseas on deployment, or perhaps I'd be too unstable to handle the property. She badly underestimated me. Knowledge nugget number 2. HOAs live on bluffing. Most homeowners are unaware of the boundaries of HOA jurisdiction. They break under the threat of fees or fines. But the reality is, HOA power only goes so far as to voluntary contracts. If you never agreed, their rules are as empty as the threats they type in their newsletters. Karen didn't know me yet. Or perhaps she assumed I was simply another pushover landowner who'd swap acres for crumbs. But I wasn't raised to cave. I observed her strutting into town halls in her white SUV, papers clutched in her hand, announcing community beautification projects. Projects that conveniently saddled adjacent families with debt while she collected contractor checks. Paper thin, Karen was unbeatable. Real life, however, she had one flaw that was fatal. She didn't care about the value of roads. And when I use the term roads, I don't simply mean asphalt. I mean history, legacy, lifelines etched through dirt and gravel by families long before her HOA kingdom ever came into being. Roads my family built. Roads my family owns. Roads her whole empire rested upon. She didn't realize it yet, but she had just made herself queen of a castle without a drawbridge. And who possessed the keys? Name's Jack Morrison, 37 years old. Third-generation owner of Morrison Ranch, 48 acres of rough Texas ground, oaks, and the gravel road that bound it all together. Most people don't give it a second glance when driving past Morrison Road. Just a small strip of gravel carving between the highway and a valley once avoided by people. Yet, there is a story behind every pothole in that road. Each mile was put down by my grandfather, Robert, a guy everyone simply referred to as Pops. Pops purchased the property way back in 1959 when Austin was still barbecue smoke and honky-tonks, not condos and tech firms. He was a rancher by heritage, but an engineer by nature. If something broke, Pops didn't complain, he fixed it better. Barns, fences, roads, hell, even the water trough system for the cows. And that gravel road? He graded it himself with a borrowed grader and determination. By the time I was born, Pops had transformed that rough road into the backbone of our land. It wasn't a road to us. It was our promise. The lifeline running cattle from water, neighbors to fields, and family to home. And when the county approached Pops asking him to open the road up to adjacent parcels, he agreed, but on his terms. That's when the 1962 easement deed was executed. A feisty little provision assuring Morrison Road would forever be family land. Knowledge nugget number 3, easements aren't just scraps of paper. They're legal chains. And if you're the one holding the lock, everyone else dances to your tune. Without legal ingress and egress, property values collapse. Banks won't finance homes. Insurance won't cover risk. That one sheet my Pops tucked away in a drawer? It was stronger than any fence he ever mended. By the time I was driving age, Pops had me making deliveries up and down that street. Every neighborly handshake, every cattle bag of feed, every water barrel, it all began on Morrison Road. Pops would stand with his truck and tell me, "Son, people forget whom they owe, but a road never does. It always reminds you who really owns the land." So when I went off to the Army Corps of Engineers, I took that lesson with me like a pocket knife. 2 tours in Afghanistan, where I was an expert in intel and logistics, ensuring supply convoys safe passage through enemy-infested valleys. Irony is, you never forget how vital a good road is when you're the one putting lives at risk just to keep it open. A blocked road could starve out battalions whole. When I returned stateside, Pops was dead. We buried him out on the ridge he preferred best. And though the land came into trust under my sister's administration while I washed the sand out of my boots, I never once forgot that road. It wasn't gravel and fence posts. It was the backbone of my family. That's why, when Karen and her crew of contractors attempted to pave over her little kingdom onto Morrison land, I didn't need to shout. I only needed to tell her whose history was etched into every tire track she drove over. Karen thought she was playing chess. The problem? She didn't know I'd been raised on a road that taught me the only moves that mattered were the ones that controlled the ground directly under your feet. And the ground under her entire subdivision was mine. The first time I knew Karen wasn't blowing smoke was the morning I woke up to the crunch of gravel underneath tires that didn't belong. Not neighbors, not postal trucks. These were heavy diesel trucks. When I went onto my porch, the valley resonated with the low rumble of cement mixers and backup alarms. I traced the dust clouds along Morrison Road, and my jaw froze when I caught sight of it. Bright orange survey flags pierced into my rear pasture, and temporary fencing stretched like a poor scar across the lawn. Neatly dressed men in neon vests scurried like ants, pouring foundations directly onto my land. Karen drove up behind me in her BMW, visor askew, iced latte in hand, as if she were showing up to a garden party. She did not even glance at the construction mess as she smiled her sugary smile. "Hi, Jack," she trilled. "Isn't it thrilling? Progress. And don't fret, we'll make it up to you eventually for any disruption. The entrance to the subdivision will be gorgeous. Just wait and see." I glared at the men hammering stakes into my land. "That's my property you're laying concrete on," I said bluntly. Karen tittered, as if I'd shared a kid's joke. "Oh, sweetheart, under county zoning, this lot officially belongs to Willow Ridge HOA now. Your sister okayed the assessments, didn't she? Everything's in writing." My teeth gritted. I had known my sister had been paying property taxes in some management service when she lived out in California. She wasn't a rancher. She didn't know a plat map from a placemat. And that management service had likely rolled over when Karen flashed some fine print and a smile. Knowledge nugget number 4. Adverse possession. An old law in Texas that was intended to keep land that's abandoned in use. When someone uses or improves land and no one objects for a long enough time, they can attempt to take title. Most often, it's squatter disputes or neglected back corners of ranches rarely ever used to subdivide multi-million-dollar developments. But rarely ever is Karen's expertise. She edged forward from her vehicle, fragrance overpowering the scent of diesel. Soldiers are always too much in sentimental mood. Don't fret, we'll rename one of the new roads after your family. Morrison Lane. Sounds pretty good, don't you agree? I said nothing. Not when the cement mixer poured out its contents into wooden forms. Not when a foreman yelled my fence line was in their path. I simply stood and watched, quiet, taking plates with my phone, my fingers brushing against the pocket where Pop's easement deed was stored. Karen misunderstood my quiet as defeat. She actually patted my arm as if it were a child. "Don't bear a grudge," she said sweetly. "Change costs something." Then she drove away, leaving me standing there in a cloud of diesel and incredulity. But she'd made her first error. She'd forgotten where the road went. By mid-afternoon, her contractors figured something she hadn't. Every truck bringing in materials was eating up Morrison Road, and Morrison Road delivered to one mailbox alone, mine. That night, I sat at Pop's old kitchen table with a strong coffee, maps spread out, and the deed in front of me. The subdivision wasn't connected to the highway. Not really. Morrison Road was their artery. Without it, those shiny new houses were just cages in a pasture. And I held the key to the only gate they had. It wasn't long before Karen understood I wasn't going to roll over. She believed a couple of contractors with clipboards and a charming smile would intimidate me out of my land. Instead, she learned the Morrison family wasn't in the business of folding. That's when the war really started. Then the letters. Official envelopes crammed into my mailbox with Willow Ridge letterhead, charging me with interfering with community development. Fines for unauthorized structures, i.e., my grandfather's barn that had been there since 1960. Threats of daily fines if I did not dismantle abandoned vehicles, or my operating tractor and hay trailer. And then the patrols. A changing group of Karen's hand-selected safety committee parked at the end of Morrison Road in folding chairs, taking down license plates of anyone who came to see me. They wore identical polo shirts, like mall guards with a bad case of the vapors. One of them brought binoculars. It was ridiculous at first until they blocked delivery trucks coming to my ranch. Cattle feed was detained at the entrance of the road while these would-be guards phoned Karen for permission to enter private community property. I took a walk down there on a sweltering August afternoon and found 3 of them hot and sweaty in their polos at the one-lane entrance. My voice was firm when I spoke up, saying, "You're parked on a private road. Move." "Sir," one of them struggled, brandishing a clipboard like a badge. "This roadway is reserved for Willow Ridge residents. HOA rules have been revised." I brandished the deed, creased and worn but still sharp enough to cut through their bilge. Read that. Then inform Margaret Thornfield that all tires that cross this road do so with my consent, not hers. Knowledge Nugget 5. HOA authority ends at ownership begins. They can dictate what their members consent to within their mapped subdivisions. But venture beyond their documented plat, and their rulebook becomes trash paper. Those waterways, amenities. If they don't own it, they don't govern it. Period. They did not read it. They did not need to. I had already begun yanking plates and documenting their checkpoints, with date and time tag video by the time. I was not here to debate. I was here to make a case. Naturally, Karen wasn't going to let her sugar-sweet reputation in town turn sour. That evening, local Facebook groups exploded. Statuses about crazy veterans who lived nearby. Anonymous rumors of violent behavior, wild late-night activity. One even suggested that I stored weapons caches on the property. Classic Karen. If she couldn't win by paper, she'd fight by rumor. But that wasn't all. Code enforcement arrived the next week. Building inspector, fire marshal, even animal control. All at once, as if they'd planned the ambush. My porch was now not up to foundation code. My barn was a fire hazard. My septic tank, recently inspected, was somehow unsafe. Each inspection ended, conveniently enough, with recommendations to seek HOA membership for easier compliance. It was classic harassment. And it made one thing perfectly clear: Karen and Rick weren't simply trying to steal my property. They wanted to bury me in red tape until I sold out. What they didn't realize was that I'd learned this strategy already overseas. Overwhelm a man with reams of paperwork, with inspections, and with bogus emergencies, and you believe he'll crack. What Karen didn't bank on is that soldiers aren't trained to crack. They're trained to adapt, to document, and to counterattack right when the enemy exposes their vulnerability. And Karen's vulnerability? That road. Morrison Road. My road. Their lifeline. Their weakness. The more they strained, the more I moved towards severing them from the only thing that made Willow Ridge meaningful. If there was one thing the Army ever taught me, it was that all fortresses have a weak link. Not the walls, not the towers, the supply line. You cut the enemy off from food, water, and ammunition, and the fortress falls from the inside. For Willow Ridge, that supply line was Morrison Road. I began paying closer attention. Each dump truck, each contractor van, each UPS delivery into or out of the subdivision had no option but to rattle over my gravel. People with shiny SUVs cursed under their breath about flat tires and dust, but none of them knew yet that without me, they were cut off. I began to dig deeper. I went to the county recorder's office, spent late nights studying yellowed plat maps, survey records, and deeds. And that's when I discovered it. The smoking gun Karen had disregarded. The plat for the Willow Ridge subdivision clearly indicated access via Morrison Road as per recorded easement 1962. Not an alternate road. Not a conditional agreement. One sentence connecting 35 brand new houses to a dusty piece of gravel my pops cut with his own hands. Knowledge nugget number 6. Insurers and lenders need legal ingress and egress before they'll finance. Without access guaranteed, houses plummet in value to nearly zero. A $500,000 McMansion is worthless the instant buyers find out they can't legally access it. Suddenly, Karen's entire growth wasn't a utopia. It was a house of cards piled on my driveway. I sat back in my chair in the records office with that plat map in my fingers and I laughed. Not the laugh of happiness, but one of comprehension. They had constructed their fantasy subdivision on sand, and my family deed was the tide rising. Back home, I began keeping records. Trail cameras were installed at each end of Morrison Road, photographing contractor plates and stamping deliveries. I documented every HOA truck, every new owner pulling in, every landscaper running their equipment across the gravel. If Karen wanted to announce to the world that Morrison Road was hers to claim, I was collecting quietly the proof that refuted that. But the more I dug, the more it turned out to get worse for Karen. It seemed that she and Rick had also falsified the development applications. They had submitted public access documents through county zoning, documents that outright contradicted my family deed. On paper, they attempted to dress up my private road as a dedicated public right-of-way. Knowledge nugget number 7. Falsifying development documents is more than a civil liability. It can initiate criminal probes. Any misrepresentation to banks or insurance companies regarding access to property that involves federal jurisdiction, mail fraud, wire fraud, even RICO if there is a pattern. I understood then this wasn't about my property. Karen and Rick had shortcut the entire way. Water lines redirected, impact fees waived, floodplain reports fabricated. They had bet their whole kingdom on no one checking a strip of gravel in my name. That was when everything changed. They believed I was but one man holding on to a ranch. I was, in fact, the only gatekeeper to survival for an entire neighborhood. Without Morrison Road, Willow Ridge wasn't home. It was a cluster of stranded houses in a pasture surrounded by barbed wire and ill will. And the man who held the keys to the only exit? That was me. If there was one thing the army ever taught me, it was that all fortresses have a weak link. Not the walls, not the towers, the supply line. You cut the enemy off from food, water, and ammunition, and the fortress falls from the inside. For Willow Ridge, that supply line was Morrison Road. I began paying closer attention. Each dump truck, each contractor van, each UPS delivery into or out of the subdivision had no option but to rattle over my gravel. People with shiny SUVs cursed under their breath about flat tires and dust, but none of them knew yet that without me, they were cut off. I began to dig deeper. I went to the county recorder's office, spent late nights studying yellowed plat maps, survey records, and deeds. And that's when I discovered it. The smoking gun Karen had disregarded. The plat for the Willow Ridge subdivision clearly indicated access via Morrison Road as per recorded easement 1962. Not an alternate road. Not a conditional agreement. One sentence connecting 35 brand new houses to a dusty piece of gravel my pops cut with his own hands. Knowledge nugget number 6. Insurers and lenders need legal ingress and egress before they'll finance. Without access guaranteed, houses plummet in value to nearly zero. A $500,000 McMansion is worthless the instant buyers find out they can't legally access it. Suddenly, Karen's entire growth wasn't a utopia. It was a house of cards piled on my driveway. I sat back in my chair in the records office with that plat map in my fingers and I laughed. Not the laugh of happiness, but one of comprehension. They had constructed their fantasy subdivision on sand, and my family deed was the tide rising. Back home, I began keeping records. Trail cameras were installed at each end of Morrison Road, photographing contractor plates and stamping deliveries. I documented every HOA truck, every new owner pulling in, every landscaper running their equipment across the gravel. If Karen wanted to announce to the world that Morrison Road was hers to claim, I was collecting quietly the proof that refuted that. But the more I dug, the more it turned out to get worse for Karen. It seemed that she and Rick had also falsified the development applications. They had submitted public access documents through county zoning, documents that outright contradicted my family deed. On paper, they attempted to dress up my private road as a dedicated public right-of-way. Knowledge nugget number 7. Falsifying development documents is more than a civil liability. It can initiate criminal probes. Any misrepresentation to banks or insurance companies regarding access to property that involves federal jurisdiction, mail fraud, wire fraud, even RICO if there is a pattern. I understood then this wasn't about my property. Karen and Rick had shortcut the entire way. Water lines redirected, impact fees waived, floodplain reports fabricated. They had bet their whole kingdom on no one checking a strip of gravel in my name. That was when everything changed. They believed I was but one man holding on to a ranch. I was, in fact, the only gatekeeper to survival for an entire neighborhood. Without Morrison Road, Willow Ridge wasn't home. It was a cluster of stranded houses in a pasture surrounded by barbed wire and ill will. And the man who held the keys to the only exit? That was me. If there was one thing the army ever taught me, it was that all fortresses have a weak link. Not the walls, not the towers, the supply line. You cut the enemy off from food, water, and ammunition, and the fortress falls from the inside. For Willow Ridge, that supply line was Morrison Road. I began paying closer attention. Each dump truck, each contractor van, each UPS delivery into or out of the subdivision had no option but to rattle over my gravel. People with shiny SUVs cursed under their breath about flat tires and dust, but none of them knew yet that without me, they were cut off. I began to dig deeper. I went to the county recorder's office, spent late nights studying yellowed plat maps, survey records, and deeds. And that's when I discovered it. The smoking gun Karen had disregarded. The plat for the Willow Ridge subdivision clearly indicated access via Morrison Road as per recorded easement in 1962. Not an alternate road. Not a conditional agreement. One sentence connecting 35 brand new houses to a dusty piece of gravel my pops cut with his own hands. Knowledge nugget number 6. Insurers and lenders need legal ingress and egress before they'll finance. Without access guaranteed, houses plummet in value to nearly zero. A $500,000 McMansion is worthless the instant buyers find out they can't legally access it. Suddenly, Karen's entire growth wasn't a utopia. It was a house of cards piled on my driveway. I sat back in my chair in the records office with that plat map in my fingers and I laughed. Not the laugh of happiness, but one of comprehension. They had constructed their fantasy subdivision on sand, and my family deed was the tide rising. Back home, I began keeping records. Trail cameras were installed at each end of Morrison Road, photographing contractor plates and stamping deliveries. I documented every HOA truck, every new owner pulling in, every landscaper running their equipment across the gravel. If Karen wanted to announce to the world that Morrison Road was hers to claim, I was collecting quietly the proof that refuted that. But the more I dug, the more it turned out to get worse for Karen. It seemed that she and Rick had also falsified the development applications. They had submitted public access documents through county zoning, documents that outright contradicted my family deed. On paper, they attempted to dress up my private road as a dedicated public right-of-way. Knowledge nugget number 7. Falsifying development documents is more than a civil liability. It can initiate criminal probes. Any misrepresentation to banks or insurance companies regarding access to property. That involves federal jurisdiction. Mail fraud. Wire fraud. Even RICO if there is a pattern. I understood then this wasn't about my property. Karen and Rick had shortcut the entire way. Water lines redirected, impact fees waived, floodplain reports fabricated. They had bet their whole kingdom on no one checking a strip of gravel in my name. That was when everything changed. They believed I was but one man holding on to a ranch. I was, in fact, the only gatekeeper to survival for an entire neighborhood. Without Morrison Road, Willow Ridge wasn't home. It was a cluster of stranded houses in a pasture surrounded by barbed wire and ill will. And the man who held the keys to the only exit? That was me. The first bullet I shot wasn't with lawsuits or bullets. It was with a chain. One late night, when the construction workers had closed up shop and neighbors had rushed their SUVs home, I drove down to the mouth of Morrison Road in Pop's old tractor and planted a heavy steel gate squarely across the entrance. Welded on hinges, padlocked chain, reflector tape for visibility. And then I sat back on my porch with a hot thermos of coffee, hearing the silence. The morning after, the mayhem started. At dawn, delivery trucks lined up on the shoulder of the highway. Amazon vans idled. Construction equipment horned. People walked down their ideal little cul-de-sacs to discover they were stranded, vacation schedules put on hold, work schedules interrupted. The development hummed like a hornet's nest prodded with a stick. And right there at the front of it all was Karen, screeching in her tennis whites, phone glued to her ear, barking orders like a general whose army had just been cut off from its supply lines. "Open this road immediately," she shrieked, her sunglasses sliding down her nose. "This is a public thoroughfare. You're endangering families." I approached slowly, steady as an oak in winter. Pointed to the sign I'd screwed onto the gate. Private property, Morrison Road. Access by recorded easement only. Then, without shouting, I said, "Show me the deed where this is Willow Ridges." Her face turned red ribbon crimson. She rummaged papers in her leather tote, pushing half-stamped documents into my face. Zoning this, variance that, paperwork based on lies. I didn't blink. Knowledge nugget number 8. Paperwork appears official until someone reads the title chain. In real property law, recorded ownership and enforceable easement rights are all that count. Karen may have sweet-talked inspectors, but sweet talk doesn't record at the courthouse. Deeds do. The sheriff showed up an hour later, summoned by Karen's frantic 911 calls. Deputy Williams, a man I'd grown up with in Little League, stepped out of his cruiser with his hat tipped low. Karen rushed him like he was her savior. "Arrest him," she screamed. "He's blocking our community entrance. These families can't leave." Williams took one long look at the sign, then at me. "Jack," he said measuredly, "you got paperwork on this?" I handed him Pop's deed. He read it in silence, then nodded once, slow and steady. "Well, ma'am," he said to Karen, "looks like what we've got here is not a crime. This here's Morrison property. Your access depends on his permission." Karen nearly exploded right where she stood. "This is extortion," she spat. I grinned for the first time that day. "No, Karen," I replied. "This is ownership. Perhaps you should have inquired before you spewed your kingdom onto my property." By evening, my phone was ringing constantly. Homeowners, contractors, even bank representatives connected to Willow Ridge mortgages were pleading. Some made nice requests. Others bullied. Each of them shared the same dilemma. Their dream homes were useless without my gravel driveway. That evening, sitting on the porch and watching brake lights dance on the horizon, it struck me, this wasn't revenge. This was strategy. This was finally fighting on territory I chose. And Karen? She was in her cul-de-sac throne, discovering she'd constructed an empire with no doors. The creaking gate waking Willow Ridge up every day was too much for Karen to bear. Losing control wasn't something she was accustomed to. So, as with any HOA tyrant cornered, she turned to her weapon of choice, the courts. Within a week I was given notice. Thick envelope, gold HOA letterhead, language that sliced through paper and cut your pride. Injunctive relief, public nuisance, denial of ingress. Their petition asserted I was maliciously and recklessly endangering families, that Morrison Road was functionally absorbed into Willow Ridge, and that I was a threat to the peace of the community. Very sweet. But the problem is this: courts only work with facts, not HOA make-believe. I had Pop's 1962 deed. I had the plat maps with the recorded easement. I had video records of them driving on my road every day without signed rights to access. And I had evidence they perjured their subdivision applications. Knowledge nugget number 9. Fraud voids everything it touches. When a developer prevaricates on zoning documents, environmental studies, or loan guarantees, they don't merely face fines. They risk bringing down their entire project by a single judge's decision. Nevertheless, Karen marched into county court as if she was hosting a luncheon. Designer suit, pearls gleaming, Rick accompanying her, and their expensive lawyers spouting lawyer talk like spells. Behind them, the other half of the HOA board was sitting in the gallery fanning themselves like Southern royalty. I entered with my attorney Amanda Cross, a bright but cutting-edge property lawyer who made headlines saddling HOAs with their own rules. She had no pearls, no patronizing grin, just toted 3 binders full of every scrap of evidence we'd uncovered. The hearing commenced. Karen's lawyer started into a melodramatic lament about irresponsible veterans, vigilantism run wild, and the reckless shutdown of a public highway. He gestured with pictures of the gate as if it were a crime scene. Then Amanda stood. Cool, detached. She placed the plat map on the table. She read out loud the deed easement of 1962. She showed time-stamped video footage of trucks and neighbors driving my private road every day without payment. Then she let the bombshell drop. The subdivision loan documents affirming to banks the property had public access. Flat-out contradiction of recorded deeds. Amanda spoke in an icy tone when she spoke the words, "Your Honor, if my client's private road was absorbed into Willow Ridge, then why is their financing deceitfully stating otherwise? Either the bank has been lied to, or this courtroom is being lied to. Which is it? The gallery was silent. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, lips clamped thin. Karen snapped. She stood up from the table, voice rising to that familiar shrill. This man has our families held hostage. He's a menace. He's weaponizing that road. The judge's gavel interrupted her. Sit down, Mrs. Thornfield. This court does not overturn 60 years of recorded property law. Whatever delusion your HOA has concerning this road, the record indicates it's private. Morrison's property. Case adjourned. But, like that, Rick cursed under his breath. Their lawyer gathered up with trembling hands. Karen leaned back into her chair, her pearls seeming strangles around her neck. Meanwhile, Amanda leaned forward to me and whispered with a smile, that wasn't just a victory. That was a nail in a coffin. Knowledge nugget number 10. In real estate disputes, a single deed is worth more than 10 attorneys. Paperwork always trumps politics. Karen wouldn't shut up, naturally. 7 days later, she was back on local TV, crying on camera about mothers trapped in their neighborhood by an unforgiving landowner. But the judge's decision had another tale to tell, and more significantly, it set something Karen hadn't thought of. With the court recognizing Morrison Road as private, all real estate agents and banks that dealt with Willow Ridge were forced to reevaluate. Home prices fell overnight. Buyers pulled out. Lenders exercised contracts. Residents who had initially celebrated Karen's crusade now were pounding on her door demanding why their investments were going down the drain like a rock. The siege she had launched against me had shattered her own walls. And I was just beginning. The humorous thing about empires is that they never topple from a single attack. They crumble from within. Willow Ridge was no exception. Following the judge's decision, it spread quickly. Banks murmured in hushed tones of insecure access. Insurance agents began hiking premiums. Real estate on the market whispered lowered prices, desperate to dump what were suddenly referred to as landlocked liabilities. And the residents? They weren't angry with me anymore. They were angry with Karen. It began at HOA meetings with whispers. A newlywed couple who'd purchased their dream McMansion stood up and wondered why no one had mentioned the road issue on their closing papers. Karen dismissively brushed it aside with that sugary tone. It's just a technicality, dear. But the couple weren't giggling when the bank threatened to call their loan. Neither were the retirees when their property taxes declined but their HOA fees increased. Things came to a head one Saturday morning when I sat on my front porch drinking coffee and heard yelling carry down Morrison Road. A group of a dozen irate residents had gathered around Karen's drive, waving papers and yelling about deception. Somebody waved copies of the court transcript proving my ownership. One woman wearing yoga pants shrieked, "You said it was public access. You lied." Karen stormed out still dressed in her whites, screaming back that I was a dangerous man, that I'd conned the system. But she was heard above her own people. That's when the resignations began. Board members resigning, one after the other, refusing to go down with Karen's sinking ship. The treasurer resigned when someone came up with receipts indicating HOA dues being siphoned off to contractor fees linked to Rick's building company. The secretary resigned after confessing she'd been instructed to ignore the road issue during construction. Knowledge nugget 11. HOA boards are not infallible. They consist of volunteers, neighbors. When fraud is uncovered, those volunteers end up as defendants like presidents. Civil conspiracy drags everyone into the dirt. Most aren't keen on losing their homes to save a dictator's ego. By September, Willow Ridge was no community. It was open rebellion. Lawsuits piled like bales of hay. Homeowners suing Karen for non-disclosure, homeowners suing the HOA for mismanagement, the bank threatening foreclosure on half-built homes. Meanwhile, my street was still mine. Daily, I drove it slowly in Pop's old truck, politely waving to homeowners trudging out to wash their SUVs in driveways they could no longer sell. Some nodded sheepishly. Others averted their eyes, ashamed at ever having joined Karen. It wasn't gloating. It was the lesson. Fraudulent foundations upon which to build progress are never progress. Roads, like legacies, don't require granite curbs and such lawns as grow in manicured boxes to be valuable. They require truth. The turning point occurred at the emergency HOA meeting. Karen had summoned it to mobilize her dwindling army and take back control. She arrived in pearls, grasping a microphone under the community park pavilion. But this time, the audience wasn't hers. Instead of applause, silence greeted her. And then one resident waving a copy of the deed I'd already presented to the court. "You lied," he said flatly. "You developed on a street you don't own. And now we all suffer." The crowd boomed. Shouts, accusations, calls for her resignation. A chant even began, "Step down, step down." Karen attempted to smile it off, attempted to laugh it away. But the fractures in her empire were no longer cracks. They were canyons. By dusk, she wasn't President Karen Thornfield of Willow Ridge HOA. She was merely a woman alone on a parking lot, hanging on to bylaws that meant nothing anymore. And I knew then, the battle was already won. By winter, the Willow Ridge HOA was gone. Broken up, bankrupt, and buried in lawsuits. Karen herself wasn't attending the meetings any longer. Rumor in town had it that she'd sold her white BMW and relocated 2 counties away, attempting to outdistance the very chaos she'd created. The last I'd heard, Rick had stepped down from his council seat after the state ethics board began sniffing around his emergency zoning changes. The subdivision half-built. A few homes vacant, shutters flapping in the breeze like empty promises. Others still lived there, but the atmosphere was very different. No more precision lawns to Karen's liking, no more road entrance gossip patrols. Just people trying to survive with the sour taste of deception. Oddly, they eventually began waving at me once more. They even apologized. One fellow made a pie and left it on my doorstep with a note, "For reminding us who really owned this road. Thank you." Knowledge Nugget 12. When HOAs fail, the land does not disappear. The rules do not dissipate into thin air. What is left are neighbors. And at the end of the day, you either build with them or against them. Guess which wins out? I left Morrison Road just the way Pops would have left it. Gravel. Straightforward. Simple. People pleaded with me to pave it, others swore at the dust. But I always remembered Pops standing against his truck, saying, "Roads don't lie, son. They tell you who owns what, plain and simple." And now, whenever a resident rumbles down that mile-long stretch into town, they're reminded. Not of Karen, not of HOA fees, not of phony bylaws and tacky threats. They're reminded that progress founded upon deceit topples, and legacy, inscribed in genuine ink on real deeds, remains. The vacant lots grew up to weeds, ringing with crickets rather than the sound of construction. My cattle grazed in peace once more, fences repaired. And my road? My road survived the empire that forgot about it. Justice is not always a loud voice like a bulldozer or a crash like a gavel. Sometimes it just hums beneath your wheels as you ride down a gravel road that never did forget your name. So when someone asks me how I dismantled an entire HOA, I don't gloat about chains on gates or court wins. I simply smile, nod at Morrison Road sending dust in the sun of the evening and say, "They built homes on my land, but I owned the road out. That's all that mattered." And that's the tale.